Okay, for the last 16 months since I've been in Ireland, one of the things I've been doing is responding to the crisis in church-state relations that has come out of the child sex abuse scandal crime. And I've been doing this in three related ways, and this is all very preliminary. I'm starting everything at the same time. One way is to look at scales of governmentality and how both church and state use different scales of response in order to manage this crisis. The second is to look at artistic articulations and responses to the crisis. And the third is what I want to talk a little bit about today, and that is to look at the relationships between bodies and spaces, a sort of choreography of church-state relations as some of the context for this crisis. So ultimately there will be a series of linked papers on church-state relations. So what I want to talk about today is something about this choreography, something about the regulation of bodies, something about the regulation of spaces. And it links very much to what John was talking about. He called it subjection. Other people have called it subjectivation, the production of subjects through interpolation and through institutions. And so something on institutions, and then something on the production of bodies. So let's start with institutions. The story of the Catholic Church in Ireland in the 19th century has often been told in terms of the devotional revolution, Cullen's turning to recognising more fully the authority of Rome, and so on. But the feature that I want to just comment upon really is the tremendous growth of religious communities in 19th century Ireland, and the institutions associated with those communities. And I want to comment upon three dimensions of this. Firstly, competitive proselytism. A number of institutions developed in response to, or chicken and egg, but institutions developed either to contest proselytism through the provision of services or to proselytize themselves. And so things like the first Magdalene asylum in Leeson Street in Dublin, just off Stephen's Green, produced great anxiety that women who were in need of shelter, who were either sex workers or destitute in some other way, might be reached by Protestant, in this case Methodists, who would offer them sanctuary, but sanctuary with strings attached, and with those strings they'd be pulled into Protestant religion, even if they were not to start with. So alongside that, then there was a great impetus to develop parallel Catholic institutions, and so you get this multiplication of institutions. So one sort of institution, there is certainly a sort of either proselytizing or competing with proselytizing dimension to it. The second is the provision of services by Catholics inside existing state institutions such as workhouses and hospitals, with nuns offering services to workhouse infirmaries and to hospitals. So what you then get is in a sense the state commissioning or subcontracting certain services to Catholic orders, and this becomes quite an important market for Catholic services. And then the third is the creation of new institutions that will survive largely on the basis of state commissions. In other words, institutions are created that require local authority or central state funding in order to exist. So, for example, orphanages, particularly important institution where local authority and then later central government monies were crucial to the founding and the existence of these institutions as a per capita payment for the children that were looked after. And these type of institutions, many of them are on the urban fringe, and in some cases they're also part of a sort of Catholic real estate development. You look at establishments, some of these institutions, for example, in Dunleary, you get local priests who are particularly keen to attract convents and the buildings that would be associated with convents, orphanages, laundries, and so on. That these become a sort of a cross between a residential institution and almost like a semi-factory. There's real economy to these institutions. Of course, there are class relations within those institutions. You have the difference between those nuns who come in with dowries and those nuns, choir nuns, who are more from a more working class background, often did more of the labour within the institutions and less of the sort of outreach work and ministering to the poor in the wider community. This relationship between Catholic institutions and urban fringe development, I think, is a striking feature of some Irish towns, and you can still go to places like Cork and you see these enormous institutions, above Sunday's Well, Drumcondra, and so on. In some respects, the asylum in Gloucester Street was an unusual institution in that it took over an existing institution, so it's not as peripheral as other such institutions were in many other places. So three things then: proselytism and competitive proselytism was an impetus to institutional development. The provision of services directly to state or local government funded institutions in ways which then changed the character of those institutions. Some of the Dublin workhouses became very, very heavily Catholic in terms of the staff within them. And then thirdly, the creation of new institutions that relied upon both the labour of the people within the institution, but also relied upon per capita grants for the provision of services. And these produce a sort of institutional archipelago that I think is a very interesting geographical feature of church-state relations in Ireland. And we can look at this institutional archipelago in snapshot from the 1901 and 1911 census. So one of the things that I want to do is just to simply use that 1911 census to document the presence of these kind of institutions, to draw out this archipelago with its particular services for different categories of people. And I've tried to identify some of these categories here just from using the institutional table for the city and county of Dublin. And I've broken these institutions down into medical institutions, those that cater to homeless people, those that are directed at the reform of the person, military institutions, that is the range of institutions within the city and county of Dublin, and I've tried to break them down into those which had were under Catholic direction, those which were under Protestant direction and had a Protestant ethos, those which declared themselves to be unsectarian, and those which were under direct government control, no sort of subcontracting of any sort. And you can see the concentration of the religious effort into dealing with homeless people and reform institutions. Now, when we look at how these institutions are represented in the census, there are some interesting things to be said about how they are reported. Broadly speaking, the census offered people a number of different forms on which to return the names of the people. So there's a household form, which most people are familiar with. This is a household form for that Magdalene institution in Lower Leeson Street, and it's the standard household enumeration form. That the names are there, the occupations and so on, the place of birth and the religion. But there are a number of other sorts of forms that some institutions used. So, for example, Maynooth is returned on a college form. Now, there were also prison forms, and the Magdalene Asylum in Lower Gloucester Street returned its inhabitants on a prison inmate's form, not a household form. I'm not exactly sure if that was their choice or whether that was the form that was sent to them. I certainly need to find that out, but it's an interesting contrast. And browsing across the census returns that are online, we can look at them now for the City of Dublin. Some institutions make household returns, and some institutions make college returns, but this is the only one that I found so far that makes a prison return. That's not actually a prison. There's also workhouse forms and so on. And what's interesting about this from the point of view of a prison return is that the prison return does not ask for names, it only asks for initials. So there's an ambivalence to the discovery that the Magdalen Asylum makes a return on the prison form, because it's using a prison form, and it makes a prison form, but it is providing full names, at least in this case. So the examination of how these institutions represented themselves in the census returns, I think, is an interesting comparative project that would be part of this description of how that archipelago worked. Okay, the second topic that I want to talk about is subjectivation, and I want to talk about how the body is treated, understood, configured within the sorts of Catholic discourses that would be behind the way this archipelago operated in much of the 20th century. John Cornwell has just recently been doing some work on the history of what used to be called confession. And John Cornwell traces regular confession and regular communion as a global phenomenon back to Pius X, early 20th century Pope, who in his crusade against modernism, whose anti-modernism, had as part of its project an attempt to re-sanctify the church, fill the church with grace through a greater attention to the sacraments. But this attention to the sacraments, in the case of Pius X, was not only regular confession and communion, but early confession and communion, that First Communion should be taken at age 7, and not as hitherto 13, 14, whatever. And that meant that catechesis also began at age 6. That meant that private individual confession began at age 7. And for John Cornwell, this is a large part of the context of bringing adult priests into contact with vulnerable children in highly charged microspaces over a very long period of time. And he says that this is a dramatic change in the sorts of subject formation that the Catholic Church had been involved with. That actually early, private, regular confession and the instruction of very young children in sin, in the examination of conscience and so on, and that this being done in a private space by an adult male is a big innovation in the way the church works. I'd like to just take this up and actually develop it in a slightly different way, and that is that the argument against the other, it's a curious response in some ways, because modernism is treated as an intellectual movement. You know, it's to do with, 5 minutes, okay, it's to do with secularism, it's to do with loss of faith and so on and so forth, and yet the child is being made the focus of attention rather than intellectual error. And I want to comment on this because what I think actually is at the heart of some of this production of the Catholic body is a particular understanding of the relations between mind, body and will. And I've been reading over the last month or so a book called Moral and Pastoral Theology, 4-volume work by an English Jesuit, Henry Davis. And I've been looking at the way the body is treated in Henry Davis, and the way the mind-body dualism works in Henry Davis. And really, the adult and child, you know, the adult is more of the mind, the child is more a prisoner of the body. The priest is of the mind, the laity are of the body. Davis says that, in fact, perfection is arrived at by denying the claims of the body upon the self, and that the priest in that sense is more a creature of the intellect, which is a higher thing than the laity who are of the body. And similarly, man and woman, the man is the mind of the family. The man must have authority in all matters relating to family discipline, but the woman has equality in one area, which is the mutual claim on each other of what Davis calls the marriage dues, and the other area is that the woman is to be the heart of the family. She is to be the one who gives the children love and who holds them to the faith. Okay, so mind and body set up these differences, but these differences are incredibly troubling because, of course, firstly, let's just start with the child. Will comes in as in a sense some part of the thing which actually delivers you grace. That the body seeks pleasure, the mind seeks truth, but the will seeks goodness, or it should seek goodness. So training the will is the way to produce a good Catholic. And this is where we then come back to the child. Because for Davis, the child, although the child has been baptised and therefore has been forgiven, or had original sin forgiven it, the original sin stays not in the soul but in the body. And Davis refers to the urgings of the flesh that he says are evident even in very small children. It's clear from the context he's talking about erections as the residue of original sin. As the residue of original sin. And therefore the child must be trained to resist the passion of the flesh, even before the child can understand anything about what's at stake. And Davis is very clear on this, that people get grace from saying prayers even if they don't understand the prayers. The child should be trained to resist the fleshly impulses to impurity, even before the child's got any idea whatsoever what's going on. This then ties in with a view of the child as requiring that its will be tamed by very early interventions around notions of impurity and guilt in advance of the child understanding anything of it. It's not to do with the mind. And that then ties up with the sorts of thing that John was talking about, the early confession and early communion. And this anxiety, I've got 2 minutes, yeah? This anxiety around the body then plays through all sorts of, all these other differentiations. There's a very long section in Davis about the fact that the priest has a body and that this is an important part of priestly ministry. And there's a discussion about whether or not the priest can satisfactorily perform as a priest if he's got one of the fingers missing that's needed to hold the host. There are discussions about how tall a priest should be before it's indecorous for him to be behind an altar. There's a section about how hideous a priest's face can be, and so on and so on and so on. The body of the priest, although it's although in a sense it's to be withdrawn from the priest in a way so that the priest can seek a higher calling, is still a source of anxiety. And the point is that there's tremendous source of anxiety around the body produced by this this schema, or at least that's what I'm suggesting. It produces tremendous anxiety about the place of bodies. And then we turn to men and women. It was written in the 1930s, republished in the edition I have is the 5th edition from 1946. It's full of stuff about women's dress. That in a sense, women have to dress very modestly, and they shouldn't paint their faces when they come to church. They have to dress modestly. There should be pious associations that go around parishes stopping women dressing in a modern way, because poor old men, although they are of the mind, their bodies too easily, they have a high sex drive. Women don't. Women don't have. The maid is the one who can control her partner before marriage, because the man can't. So you have this separation between the man as of the mind and the woman as the woman is of the body, but it's the regulation of the woman's body that's necessary, because that is what stimulates the man. So, you know, tremendous anxiety is being produced around the female body, and arguments that parents should prevent their daughters mixing and having close friendships with people of the other sex, that it's far better for young girls to be in public as little as possible. They certainly shouldn't take part in any public gymnastics displays, and McKay had mixed sports days banned from Catholic schools in Ireland. A tremendous anxiety about the presence of the female body in public place, unless that body is already anchored into a respectable marriage. So what we see here, I think, is a set of anxieties around choreographing the body, alongside the elaboration of a set of institutions which cloistered certain sorts of bodies in certain places. And these two things together are at the heart both of I think some of the physical assaults on children to break their will. I think some of the motivation, at least some of the motivation behind Christian brother violence to young children is about breaking their will. And also, I think these anxieties about the body produce standards for people to live by, which were simply impossible, as Mary Keenan argues in her recent book. And this, I think, is part of the context for the current crisis in state-church relations in Ireland. Thank you.